Hi, and welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Mark Sun. Matt Manacharian is off today. We're joined by Alex Vigderman from the R&D team. Hola. And Nathan Cooper from our Operations and Scouting Group.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So there's a bit of a theme going on these last 2 weeks. It seems like a lot of the good teams have had hiccup games, and we'll dive right in. Alex, what was your biggest takeaway from last week's games?
Kind of to that point, to me, the thing that this week solidified is that we're, more than halfway through the season, and there's still a lot of uncertainty about who the best contenders are. Are certain teams good? Are the teams that we expected to be good that had kind of struggled through some of the middle of the season? Are they back now? The Bucs took a revenge L at the hands of Taylor Heineke. The Bills and the Chiefs, who had offenses that people were worried about, they woke up. The Rams got crushed. And with, even besides those teams, we have multiple key quarterbacks, Kyler Murray, Aaron Rodgers, who have been sort of out of the lineup and struggling at times. And so there's just a lot of uncertainty this far through the season. And that I feel like we're going to see even more of these sorts of like ebbs and flows as we go towards the end.
To that point, Cardinals 1, Buccaneers 2. They're basically tied. Rams 3, Bills 4, Cowboys 5. In our power rankings, the Raiders were the top AFC team last week. They are now the 5th AFC team in our total points, combined stats, power rankings. Cardinals, Bucks, Rams, Bills, Cowboys, this week's top 5. Coop, your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, I agree with Alex, and I sort of want to piggyback off of that a little bit. Whenever you're looking at the record, the top 3 teams in the league, you're looking at the Cardinals, the Packers, and the Titans. And going into this season, I don't think we would have really said that. And if you would have said that, this far into the season, it would have been a big surprise. And I think it is a big surprise right now. The Cardinals, they did add a bunch of weapons on the offensive side of the ball, but I don't think anyone thought they'd be 8-2. And honestly, they could have been better at this point if Kyler Murray doesn't get hurt. Maybe they're 9-1. So we're not sure about that. Obviously, the huge Aaron Rodgers saga in the offseason. We thought that the Packers would still be the Packers. Aaron Rodgers is still Aaron Rodgers. But I think 8-2 is still a little surprising for them. And then the Titans, obviously a good team last year. They added Julio Jones on the offensive side. That defense is really coming together. Harold Landry is really turning into one of the premier edge rushers. But then Derrick Henry goes down. So you're wondering, what's happening here. Ryan Tannehill's not playing great, but they just keep finding a way. And really now being 8-2 after the 5 weeks that they just had is pretty incredible. So going along with what Alex said, there's a lot of uncertainty at the top and a lot of surprise for sure.
There's a 4-way tie essentially for 9th in our power rankings, which is Chiefs, Raiders, Ravens, and Titans, with the Chargers right behind. I'm looking at this. It is really tightly bunched statistically. And this is our first year looking at total points from this perspective. And by the way, one thing that I thought was kind of funny is on the other end of things, the Lions are not the number 32 team. The Jets are not the number 32 team. The Texans are not the number 32 team. The number 32 team by combined total points from their players is the Atlanta Falcons, 4-5.
I have to imagine that their performance last week is a very big contributor to that.
Yeah, no kidding. Like clearly that had to play a pretty big role. So we move on here, and there were a couple of discussions that we wanted to have before we got into this week's games and things that are specific that I think are cool to talk about. You both, when I asked for topics this week, you both said, let's talk rookies. So let's talk rookies. Let's start with the Rookie of the Year candidates. Coop, let's start on the offensive side. We're starting with Ja'Marr Chase, right?
Yeah, I think you have to. I think he's the top contender on the offensive side, at least for me. And I'll admit, coming into the year, you have all these quarterbacks poised to start, these rookie quarterbacks. I thought it would have to be a quarterback. Right now, I think it's Chase, though. You're looking among all of the wide receivers in the NFL, 5th in yards, 6th in yards per route run, 4th in YAC, tied for 5th in touchdowns, and all this, 16th highest in ADOT, average depth of target. So there were questions around this pick in the draft process. All right, the Bengals offensive line is bad. They need to go offensive line, but they decided to go with Chase, pair him back up with Joe Burrow. And I think when this offense is on and humming, it's a tough team to defend, and Ja'Marr Chase is really a big reason why.
Did he match what you guys basically expected from your scouting report that you wrote on him coming into the draft?
Yeah, I think so. I think, we were obviously high on him. I think we had him number 2 behind Waddle, and Waddle's played really well as well. But Chase has just been a little bit, step up, and he's really elevated that Bengals offense, I think.
So on the other side, the same side of the ball, but different spot, we talked quarterbacks. And I remember I feel pretty confident that in talking, I don't remember if it was to you or to John Todd or someone else, but when we were talking about who the rookie of the year was going to be, Trevor Lawrence was going to be like the guy. That was it. But Mack Jones has been the most impressive quarterback so far. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I was the one that said Trevor Lawrence, and I think it was hard to go wrong at that point. But Mac Jones has been the guy, especially the last few weeks. He's really played well. And honestly, a couple of weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, I think, if we were talking about this, I think Jamar Chase was the guy, and I don't think it really would have been close. But Jones has played well the last couple of weeks, and I think he's really in the discussion here. He's played confident, rarely puts the ball in harm's way, and he just seems like one of those guys. He just knows how to be an NFL quarterback. Whenever you're looking at a couple stats here, 15th in the entire league in IQR, tied 9th in catchable percentage, and he's 11th in on-target percentage. And whenever you look at these awards, these things typically go to quarterbacks, especially if they have good numbers. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Mac Jones firmly in it and even win it if he plays this well the rest of the season.
Should the 49ers have taken him when they had their chance?
Even 49ers, Jets, one of those teams definitely could have.
Well, hang on. That's easy hindsight right now, right?
Exactly.
Is there anything that he's exceeded expectations in from the scouting report that you had before the NFL draft?
I mean, he was a guy that he didn't really have a high ceiling. He was more of a low ceiling but high floor type of guy, and I think he's hit everything that we've thought that he could be. We didn't think that he was going to really come out and really set the world on fire. But again, we got to realize he's played half a season. He still has a long way to go in his development and everything, but he's played really well so far, and it's hard to argue against that. And he's done what the Patriots have needed him to do.
If he's a low ceiling, high floor guy, like he entered into a situation in which that's exactly what you're going to expect. It's a team that's predicated on defense. They want to run the ball. They want to sort of control things. And so that offense presents a situation that makes him low ceiling, high floor. And so it kind of, blends really nicely as opposed to some of these other quarterbacks that came into situations that weren't necessarily as ripe for success right out of the gate.
Alex, we talked about Mac Jones with Coop. You talked about him as well. Through the lens of total points, you see the offensive rookie of the year tilting his way?
Yeah, I think it's tilting his way, although I will say that the Rookie of the Year award is less similar to like the MVP, where it sort of has to go to a quarterback. I think it's more about value relative to your position and less about sort of total value. So I do think that guys like Chase have a chance there. I will mention that Devontae Smith should also be in this conversation, given the kind of run that he's had recently. And, Coop mentioned all the stats that Chase is very high in. Another stat that he's high in is drops, which was one of the things that we saw in the preseason that people got a little bit worried about. And obviously, that's only a handful of plays every year. But in terms of like sort of the trade-off between the value you would have been getting if you made that completion versus the value you end up not getting because you had the incompletion, that value really makes the difference between those two players. So like from a total points perspective, we have Devontae Smith at like 18 total points over the course of the season and Chase at only 11. So it actually ends up being tilting in the other direction because of the lost value that Chase ends up giving up.
So a 7-point gap there, single player. And just to put total points in a place where people can kind of grasp them. We talked about the Falcons being 32 and the big drop and teams being tightly packed. Can Chase make up 7 to 8 points easily?
Yeah, for sure. A big game for a receiver is somewhere in the like 4-point range. And if you compare it to like a quarterback, that's typically more in like the 6 or 7 for like an average quarterback game. So yeah, a big day from Chase, bad game from Smith could definitely switch that. But it's more of a reflection of, I think people have the perception that Chase is really out in front here. Vegas definitely has that perception as well. And I think that from a total production perspective, considering sort of the positives and negatives and weighing them, Smith, it really is at least in that conversation, and if not more productive. And obviously, the narrative at the start of the season was way in Chase's favor, and it's sort of been tilting back towards Smith.
I like the versatility that we've shown in the early part of the show with Coop dipping into the stats, Alex dipping into kind of player personnel fit with teams. And let's keep that going here. Let's talk defense. Micah Parsons has been great for the Cowboys so far. Coop, where do you stand on him?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things we talked about with Parsons coming in, coming out of the draft is his coverability. That was one of the big questions. didn't know if he really had the coverability. It would take a little bit of time to really get it. And while he hasn't been great in coverage and really looked lost at times, it hasn't really been that bad. Two of the big things that really have not been a question for him at all: versatility and athleticism. He's an incredible athlete, and he's a guy that can play off ball. He can play on the edge. And whenever that he moves down to the edge, that Cowboys defense is dynamic. He basically plays like an edge rusher whenever he comes off the edge. You're looking at 6 sacks, 21% pressure rate. Looking at linebackers with at least 10 pressures, 21% pressure rate. That's 7th in the league. So right now, I think Parsons has to be the top contender for the Defensive Rookie of the Year.
12th overall pick in the draft out of Penn State, our state. We like that. What about the two corners?
Yeah, 2 corners out in the AFC West, all-pro cornerback fathers as well. So Pat Surtain and Asante Samuel, both in the top 11 of total points in corners. I think they're playing really well. And these are 2 guys, obviously, high picks, Surtain in the top 10, Samuel in the second round. But these are 2 guys that they weren't really expected to be starters right away. Maybe it would take a little bit of time. And corners are really one of that position that it's tough to go out there and play well right away as a rookie. But Surtain has basically played every game. He started every game except for week 1. And Samuel has started for every game for the Chargers as well. So these guys have come in, played really well. Surtain's tied 3rd in corners in pass defenses with 10. Samuel's 18th in passer rating against. Parsons, like I said, is the front runner, but I don't think you can count these 2 guys out right now.
Is there any way in which you kind of made it sound like they've both exceeded expectations? Is there any specific thing that they do that has particularly impressed you?
Just looking at their coverability. Like I said, for corners, it's really tough for rookies to come out and play well at the cornerback position. Look at Trayvon Diggs last year compared to this year. Like last year, he did have some interceptions and stuff, but was giving up long plays. He's sort of doing the same thing this year, but it's tough to come out and play well as a rookie. And I think these 2 guys have done, fairly well, and especially in the AFC West, which is a pretty high passing division.
I think Alex and Cooper in agreement here. Parsons, right?
Yeah, we're Pennsylvania guys who go for the PSU product. Parsons has been super productive. In fact, not only tops among rookies in terms of total points, one of the best linebackers in the NFL overall. And as Coop said, the expectation for his coverability was not that great. And the Cowboys, to their credit, have not put him in a ton of positions to sort of fail in that respect, focusing him more on pass rush. And he's lived up to that. In the rookie handbook, we had a stat called total points rating, which takes players sort of per play total points and scales it relative to that particular stat and puts it on like a sort of Madden scale or like a grades and class scale. And he was 99s in pass rush and in run defense, and not so much as a coverage guy. And the Cowboys have just said, hey, do what you do well. And he's definitely delivered that. Pressure rate, super high. Coop actually undersold him a little bit. Among guys who have at least 100 attempts in terms of pass rushes, he's the best in pressure rate. So done a great job there. In run defense, he's been able to make tackles close to the line of scrimmage, and he's been a pretty sure tackler as well. So just been really good at the things that he's meant to be good at. And credit to the Cowboys for also putting him in that position.
And it's one of those things that they've had some injuries on the edge as well. And I think that sort of helped them, force a guy like Parsons who has that ability to go to the edge and sort of come off there. And I think they realized that. Obviously, you could see that, from his time at Penn State. But whenever he did that the first couple of weeks that they put him there because of the injuries and stuff like that, I think they realized, okay, we have something here. And they started to put him there a little bit more as the season's progressed.
I do think that positional versatility is underrepresented in this exact way. Like people talk about positional flexibility and guys who, you see the things on Twitter or whatever, like, oh, here are the number of snaps that this guy's played at all of these different positions. And that's one kind of versatility where he can sort of bounce around in a given game, but also being able to flex into a spot when your team needs you. A guy goes down, you're able to pick up something. That's a different kind of value. And that's something that he's definitely shown.
Alex, you're talking right out of the Bill James handbook on the baseball side.
It was not lost on me.
Very nice. So I want to stick with that just for a second here. It's kind of going peripheral to that. You didn't mention the defensive backs. And I'm curious if you can explain to people defensive back versus a player like Parsons from a mathematical perspective. Can a defensive back impact the game at the same level that someone like Parsons can?
Yeah, I don't want to wade too deep into the pass rush versus pass coverage thing that tends to be a hot topic for football analytics. I will say that they're absolutely on a similar scale. Pass rush obviously sort of gets the first jump at it. And so oftentimes you get opportunities because you're just getting to the quarterback faster. You have a chance to impact the quarterback before a defensive back necessarily has a direct impact on the play. The thing that's big for defensive backs that is not necessarily projectable, and this is one of the reasons why defensive back statistics are very variable over time, is that they have these big plays, right? These big chunk plays, interceptions, they get returned for touchdowns. EPA gets all over the place. You end up getting plays that are 10 points or something for one single play. You don't get nearly as much of that with pass rush. You get more opportunities to make these like small gains, even just pressures, sacks, stuff like that. Whereas the coverage guys are going to have fewer opportunities where they're targeted. And then sometimes they'll have these big plays one way or the other. And so that makes it a lot harder to project those players. But it also does, it makes for an opportunity for those defensive backs to have big representations of their value if you're using things like EPA.
Okay, I was just thinking from the perspective of the true shutdown corner and just how much a guy like that is worth compared to a linebacker.
Yeah, so total points takes into account your ability to deter targets. We have sort of an expectation of how likely you are to be targeted and assign an EPA value to sort of like what the target would have been if you had been targeted, and then basically giving you credit for that not happening. And so while, yes, if you just counted like pass rush snaps versus targets or something like that, like you have a lot more opportunities as a pass rusher. But if you're including all of the coverage snaps and you're giving some value to not being targeted and forcing the quarterback to look some other direction, then yeah, the cornerback does have plenty of opportunity to affect the game.
Coop, could the two rookies that we're talking about on the cornerback side, could they be like total shutdown guys?
I think they can be. Surtain is one of those guys. We had him as a blue chip type of guy. And, coming out, he's definitely played that way this year, especially as a rookie. And like I said, it's tough to do that. But, his progression over the next couple of years will be huge. And everything that he's showing right now definitely, shows that he can do that. Samuel, we had him as the number 6 corner in the rookie handbook. We probably undersold him just a little bit, but he's playing on, I think when the Chargers have one of the better defenses when healthy. And I think he's one of those guys that can really, make that team jump up there and playing, solid on the defensive side. So yes, I really think these two guys can be lockdown guys here in a couple of years.
I do want to mention, if we're talking about a couple of years from now, J.C. Horn, who got hurt a few weeks into the season, he was our number 2 corner coming into the year, or coming out of college, I guess. And he was having a few games, who knows what that is, but on a per play basis, he was one of the better players in terms of total points per play, and got hurt. And obviously the Panthers ended up going for Stephon Gilmore. So on a defense that is pretty good, I think coming back from an injury, whether it's at the very end of this year or heading into next year, I do think that he's a name to keep an eye on.
Nice. We've given people the stars. We've given people a couple of under the radar kind of guys. Moving from rookies of the year, let's take a broader view of rookies, and let's do it at the quarterback spot. Trevor Lawrence, Jaguars, Urban Meyer, rough year, very rough year. Alex, how are things with him?
Rough.
Exactly.
Yeah, obviously people expected more from him given the pedigree. But we have to remember that the guys taken in this spot are often not given much to work with. And in this case, he has the added strain of dealing with whatever Urban Meyer is trying to do. But obviously, context matters. And the roster isn't exactly rife with talent. In terms of what he's been asked to do and how well he's done relative to that, he's been asked to take a little bit deeper drops than average. So you get a little bit more pressure. And that team is not necessarily built to make a lot of plays downfield. They don't have the weapons that are going to really stretch you that way. And so Lawrence has also held onto the ball a little longer. You get more pressure. Obviously, you don't produce as well in that situation. Although I will say that in college, he actually had better pressure numbers in terms of independent quarterback rating than he did without pressure a couple of seasons. So it's not necessarily something that you expect to project going forward. In fact, I would almost insist you don't. But his performance under pressure, unsurprisingly, not very good, and has been pressured quite a bit. And part of that is offensive line stuff, but a lot of it is definitely on him. One thing I'll mention that I researched for this is looking back at first-round quarterbacks over the last handful of years and their total points through the first 10 weeks of the season. And the guys at the top are like Deshaun Watson, Kyler Murray, and Justin Herbert. And obviously those are guys who worked out in the longer term. Herbert, I suppose, is a little bit of a work in progress given some of the last couple weeks, but generally we like the way that those guys' early careers went. And Mack Jones is right below that group. So that's good for Mack Jones, although, sort of substantially or notably lower on a sort of the next tier below those three guys. And Lawrence is more towards the bottom. But he is sandwiched between guys like Josh Allen and Sam Darnold, who are sort of opposite ends of the spectrum of like what guys who didn't necessarily show that much in the first couple of years can do. Allen obviously struggled for a couple of years and then things clicked. And he's going to be the example that people use for years now of guys who you need to give them a couple of years to figure it out. And that's probably more the case with raw guys coming out of college. Allen is more of that example than Lawrence is. Lawrence was expected to be someone who could sort of produce coming right out of college. So that, I guess, is more of a concern. But it is something to sort of keep in mind for these guys who don't necessarily, blow things up in the first season.
Like you mentioned earlier, Mack Jones getting into the situation with the Patriots that he got put in, it is the perfect situation. And you talked about it. The Jags, they don't have a lot of talent down there right now. It's definitely a work in progress. James Robinson's been a little bit beat up. Obviously, they drafted Travis Etienne to be in there. He hasn't even been there. Not that they probably should have drafted him in the first round anyway, but just another weapon that he could have had. DJ Chark's been hurt. Just a lot of injuries on that side of the ball and just like not a lot of talent. So I think, for him, there is a little bit more leeway just because of that. But like you did say, when you're expected to be good and especially be good right away whenever you're the first overall pick. So it's definitely sort of an up and down type of thing for him. But I think as that roster hopefully continues to improve and sort of turns over a little bit, hopefully he can kind of find his groove a little bit.
Trying to move up the ladder. We talked about Mack Jones, who's playing on Thursday night, so his game not factored into this conversation. Alex, what about Zach Wilson?
I mean, it's not a great look. I think the New York.
What about
media,
Mike White?
Yeah, right, exactly. The New York media thing. I don't know. Who knows? But I think that I really want to take some time, and I haven't spent this time to understand like what's the deal with the Jets. Like it's just they can't figure out, and they get these like weird bursts of quarterback play, but just in general, their inability to produce sort of like consistent production on offense in a way that's like sort of violently bad. Like, Darnold went almost immediately to like, if we have our world's number one quarterback ratings, like Darnold was hanging around in the bottom for a while, and Wilson went sort of straight down there as well. So it's something's in the water there, and it definitely deserves a little bit more investigation. And it's not an Adam Gase thing necessarily, and it probably isn't literally something in the water, but it's. And I will say that Wilson is like the Josh Allen example. He was a guy who was more of a raw talent type player from a smaller school. I don't think that people expected him to light things up in the first year like they would have expected from Lawrence or Jones, who might have been expected to just walk in and be able to figure things out a little better. So I do think there needs to be some patience given there. New York is not necessarily the best place for that, given what already happened when they took Darnold. But I do think there needs to be a little bit more time and a little bit more care given.
A little bit more precedent, too, than just Darnold going back a ways. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wilson's one of those guys where you watch him in college coming out, he's more that gunslinger type. Like he wants to make the plays, more that Mahomes type of style. And I don't think he can do that right off coming into the NFL. And you could see some of those plays, especially in the first couple of weeks, he's out there throwing off of 1 foot and kind of fading away, trying to make those Mahomes and Aaron Rodgers type of throws, and he's throwing 4 picks. I think he needs to try and settle in, kind of learn the NFL style game first. And I think, like you said, it's going to take a little bit of time, because I think he is one of those guys that needed to come in and sit. Obviously, the Jets not a situation where he can come in and sit. He's going to have to kind of go through it. But hopefully he can kind of get that over these next couple of years and really develop those sorts of things, so he can be that type of gunslinger guy where we know he can make the throws and we can make the plays, but it's going to take a little bit of time.
I do think the gunslinger thing is an interesting point. Like the guys like Mahomes or even to a sort of lesser extent, like Matthew Stafford, who's sort of like throw things from weird arm angles and kind of trust their arm to handle these kinds of things. Like you can see even when Stafford going from Detroit to LA, like talent around you allows you to do that. You can throw from off platform and throw something that might be a little bit off target because you can trust the guys around you to make plays after that. And if you don't have the talent around you and you're doing all that weird stuff, like guys aren't going to pick you up when you make a throw that's a little bit off target, that you made an impossible throw across your body or whatever. So you do have to lower expectations for a guy like that who doesn't have the talent around him.
Uphill climb for him, uphill climb for Trevor Lawrence as well. Moving from rookie quarterbacks, two guys that are going uphill, we just talked about, to a guy who might be at the top of the hill. This has been somewhat of a running dialogue the last few weeks among Alex and myself. We've incorporated it, Alex has, into articles that we've done. Coop, is Kirk Cousins an elite quarterback?
He seems like he's trying to play like it this year. 18-2 touchdown to interceptions, 90% catchable percentage ranks first. 81% on target rate ranks third, 115.8 IQR ranks second. All really good numbers. But then there's a few other factors that I want to throw in there and look at. Average throw depth is only 6.9. That's the third lowest in the league. And then he's faced the ninth highest pressure, which obviously that's a lot of pressure, but he's only been sacked 12 times, and that's the second fewest. So there's a few other factors here to look at. Vikings offensive line has played really well. They've kept him clean. He's done some good things, this year, puts up good numbers, doesn't turn the ball over. And I think that's been sort of his mantra of his career. He tries to be that game manager type of guy. But when you look at everything, I don't think we can really say Kirk Cousins is an elite quarterback. He doesn't have the elite numbers. He doesn't have the elite stature, I don't think. So I think he's a good player. I think he's a good quarterback, put up good numbers, but I don't think he's elite.
He's number 2 in the player total points leaderboard at quarterback for this season. Justin Herbert is number 1. By the way, we didn't talk Justin Fields with the rookies. We talked about him in last week's episode. So that's why we moved on. Alex, your thoughts on Kirk Cousins?
Yeah, speaking of Kirk Cousins being number 2 in things, he was number 2 in our world's number 1 quarterback ranking last week, and that's just like a wild thing to think about. But I think that, first of all, Coop stole my bit with all the stats, so good on you. I think that the elite thing, obviously it's a bit of a meme, but the conversation honestly starts with the rest of the quarterbacks and how Cousins fits into the context there. Like Cousins has been more steady than normal, and other quarterbacks have been less steady than normal. You have Brady with bad games, Rodgers with bad games, Mahomes with a series of bad games, Josh Allen going up and down, Kyler Murray not necessarily being quite as productive, certainly as a rusher than we'd expect. And all these guys who are having just like performances or being much more volatile. Like an elite quarterback in 2021 isn't necessarily a typical elite quarterback. We're not seeing as much consistency from the guys at the very top. And so there's room for guys like Cousins to, by being just pretty good and showing up and not having awful games, to produce like an elite quarterback without having elite skills and elite production if you compare to other seasons. So I think that while we can say, yeah, he's been very good this year and his production has been among the best quarterbacks this year, part of that is just because the context around him has been much more chaotic than normal.
I think there is something to say, though, for a guy who goes kind of like little above average, points above average wise, little above average, points above average wise, medium above average, lot above average, little above average, little above average, medium above average. Like that's his season, right? Like I think he does deserve at least a little bit of credit. Oh
yeah, and Matt always talks about the win with, win because of type quarterback classifications. Cousins is absolutely a win with quarterback, and I'm, as a Philly fan, like I'm aware that Nick Foles can be a Super Bowl winning quarterback, and he's definitely above that level. And so, in terms of expectations that Vikings fans should have, or expectations that people should have in general of his performance, like he's a very good quarterback. And I wouldn't, pick him at the top if I was drafting all players to start my team, but he's definitely a guy that you feel comfortable throwing out there relative to the sort of overall collection of quarterbacks. And he's on a pretty good run right now. And to your point, like he's been pretty consistent relative to the rest of the league.
World's number 1 quarterback. I can read it off to you from my screen. Tom Brady, number 1. Cousins number 2, Mahomes number 3, Justin Herbert 4, Aaron Rodgers 5, Josh Allen, who had the huge game last week, 6, then Matthew Stafford and Kyler Murray. That's your top quartile in the NFL, your top 8 at the moment, and that's over multiple years. That's not just necessarily tied to this season. We'll break. We'll come back and talk about this week's games in just a moment. Before we move along, I want to talk about the Data Hub Pro. We've talked about it on previous shows. It's SIS's Data Hub tool. It's a tool on which you can find almost anything. Many of the things that were said in this show come from the Data Hub Pro. Alex has used it this week to prepare extensively. Alex, what have you found on the Data Hub Pro this week?
Well, you'll hear a little bit more in terms of my game previews, but any of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of splits for players or total points for any individual player, rankings, all that kind of stuff. And one of the big things that we added this year was a tendency reports application, which is hugely useful to look at offensive and defensive tendencies over different ranges of weeks in different situations. So it's really been helpful for me, especially for this kind of show.
You can find the Data Hub at pro.sisdatahub.com. Check it out. Give it a try. Moving on to games. We're only going to do 2 games this week. We spent a lot of time talking about rookies. That was like our big topic for this episode. And I like the Cousins elite discussion. So we're going to start with the marquee game of the week, Cowboys-Chiefs. The Cowboys coming off of a huge win. The Chiefs coming off of a huge win as well. We talked about hiccup games at the start of the show. Cowboys had one against the Broncos. They recovered. The Chiefs seem to be past the hiccup stage. They just drubbed the Raiders. Cowboys have a 3-game, 12-day stretch. They're coming off a dominant performance. Dak looked good. Defense allowed nothing. Mahomes was Mahomes for KC. Lots of big plays, lots of guys involved. Alex, what's the number one thing you're going to be watching this week from a statistical perspective?
Well, I think we still have to be on the watch for this whole single high safety, 2 high safety thing. Although I will say that that narrative is a bit overstated in terms of the Chiefs because they beat up on the Eagles defense and they ran a lot of 2 high looks and they struggled against the Packers and they ran a lot of single high. So I don't think that that's as clean of a thing as people have really made it out to be. But it's definitely worth keeping an eye on for the Chiefs and also honestly for the Chiefs defense. Through the first handful of weeks of the season where they were allowing 30 points per game, they were using a lot more single high. And since then they've allowed half that in terms of scoring and they've used a lot more 2 high. So that's something to keep an eye on for the Chiefs really on both sides of the ball. I'll also mention for the big player matchups, Trayvon Diggs possibly covering Tyreek Hill is just like a big play waiting to happen in either direction, especially if, in those situations where Hill comes into the slot, a lot of big plays come out of that alignment for him. And Diggs, when he's been in the slot, generally plays outside, but he does definitely move into the slot a fair amount. Targets when he's the defender coming out of the slot are 60% either a big positive play for the offense or a big positive play for the defense in terms of EPA. So if Hill is in that alignment and Diggs is covering him, you can expect interceptions, you can expect big plays, like any of that stuff.
Yeah, I wanted to start off with the Cowboys. Finally, they played a good game, complete game on both sides of the ball, albeit, it was the Falcons, but Dak looked like Dak. The defense made play after play. I like what the run game did as well. Even though Pollard and Elliott, they only had, 42 and 41 yards rushing respectively, but they were able to control the ball and then hit the big plays in the passing game. CeeDee Lamb's really turning into a big-time playmaker, had a big-time game, 90-some yards and 2 touchdowns. And then you have Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup now finally healthy. That's a tough offense to defend. And I think they've finally gotten to that point in the offensive side that as long as they're healthy, I think it's a tough team to go up against. And, like you said with Alex, with the Chiefs, Tyreek Hill and Trayvon Diggs, that's the big matchup here. But the Chiefs as a whole, that's the performance we've been waiting on for how long now. What they did the Raiders is what we've been used to seeing with the Chiefs over the past few years. Mahomes did spread the ball around, but he finally started to check the ball down to his open receivers underneath. Mahomes is one of those guys where, he wants to make the big dime play. He wants to go deep to Tyreek Hill. If it's not open, he needs to check the ball down. Mahomes can make the big plays, and that's how he hurts defenses. But whenever he can check the ball down and then make the defense pay on a mistake is where he really, comes into play. And then one of the other things that I just wanted to touch on is the offensive line. Mahomes has faced the 3rd most pressure in the league, so he's been pressured a lot. And that's still a young offensive line, still kind of a pieced together offensive line. Orlando Brown just coming in for his first year, a couple of rookies, but I think those two rookies, Creed Humphrey and Trey Smith, played really well. But they've had 3 different right tackles in the past couple of weeks due to injury. So I think once everything kind of comes together, hopefully it comes together here later in the season, and they kind of have that run going into the playoffs, and it'll be the Chiefs that we know. So everything's sort of coming back together. And if everything works out here, this should be a pretty good matchup.
You mentioned it very briefly. Cowboys running looked good last week, even though the yardage was small. Chiefs run defense by total points, last in the NFL.
It should be an interesting matchup. Ezekiel Elliott's your pound the rock type of guy, but he's been catching the ball. Pollard, your kind of third down back who's going to make catches, has also been being able to run through the tackles. I like what they have in the run game, and I think they're a well-rounded offense, and it could be a tough matchup for the Chiefs' run defense.
A prediction based on absolutely nothing. I think this is going to be a last possession game, last possession wins.
If everything goes well and everything that we've seen the last couple of weeks from these two teams, I think it should be.
Chargers Steelers. Let's talk the other game, as we're going to do 2 this week. Justin Herbert now has 3 games this year with a sub 60% completion percentage, sandwiched around this mega game that he had against the Eagles. And a lot of people have had mega games against the Eagles. Let's start with him. Coop, who is this guy?
It's a good question. I know the last time I was on a little while ago, we talked about if Herbert was going to be, is he elite? And since then, he's been average. So, he's been up and down the last few weeks. And if you look at some numbers, since week 6, on target percentage is just 23rd in the league. His IQR is just 16th. And he's turned the ball over 4 times. And all this with the 8th lowest average throw depth. So putting all that together, not a great recipe for success here. But with that said, he's coming up against the Steelers. Steelers are kind of up and down on the defensive side. But he has the Broncos, the Bengals, and the Giants after that. So this could be a chance that he kind of gets back on track before he goes up against the Chiefs for the second time of the season and kind of finishes off that last stretch going into the playoffs. So I think he's still a good quarterback. Obviously, he just sort of needs to settle down a little bit. And I think everyone else needs to kind of step up around him.
Meanwhile, the Steelers, they're unimpressive week after week. And yet here we are talking about them because they're still in the thick of things in the AFC North. Alex, who is this team?
This team is everything but a quarterback, I guess. Ben Roethlisberger is the worst quarterback in the league by total points. Oddly, Josh Rosen is second worst, and he has like 8 passes this year. So good on Josh Rosen. But yeah, Roethlisberger is cooked in a way that I think even the people who are like a little bit conservative about him probably wouldn't have expected. And, they have some skill position players. Najee Harris has not been like outstanding as a rookie running back, but has been fine and has been available. And the defense, as expected, has been pretty good. And so that's going to keep you in games. It's going to keep you competitive. But if the quarterback is just, below replacement level, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, you'll win some games. You'll keep things close. You'll also have games where you just lose inexplicably against terrible teams. And of course, that was the Steelers' MO regardless. But the team is not great. And given the quarterback situation, like any expectations for them having, I suppose you could argue that they could sneak into the playoffs, but it doesn't matter. The team has no upside with the quarterback situation they have right now.
Ouch. I'll have to file that comment away because that could come in handy if they win a playoff game. To close the show, we're going to go into scouts versus stats, as we like to do. Last week, we talked about who the number 1 pick in the draft would be, which teams would be most likely to have the number 1 pick overall. Let's go beyond that. Coop, who are some of the guys that you like that are more in the number 5 spot and beyond range in this year's draft?
Yeah, there's a lot of fun guys we can talk about here. And usually I'm going to be a guy talking about the offensive side of the ball. But John Todd and I, we're actually going down to Michigan and Maryland this weekend. So we're going to see 2 of the best edge rushers in the country, Aiden Hutchinson and David Ojabo from Michigan. Looking at Hutchinson, 9 sacks, 48 pressures. Those 48 pressures tied for 4th most in the country and a pressure rate over 19%. And then Ojabo has 10 sacks. He's tied for 7th most, 31 pressures, and pressure rate is 17%. So 2 guys putting up big time numbers. And when you watch them play on the edge, 2 very skilled pass rushers. They're long, they're strong, play with good bend, have a variety of pass rush moves, and most of all, relentlessness. And whenever you're talking about Michigan pass rushers, they're known for being relentless and getting to the quarterback, and these 2 fit right along in with it. Neither of them have to enter the draft this year, but I think that's more of a question for Ojabo being just a third-year sophomore. But these guys are firmly in the first-round discussion, and really top 10 isn't out of the question for either of these guys. Some guys have Hutchinson in the top 5, Ojabo around that top 10. So I think these are two guys that are really firmly in that area. And I'm excited to see these guys up close this weekend.
What does it mean to play with good bend?
You want to have good ankle flexion. You want to be able to kind of get parallel and get around and sort of get deep and dip under tackles whenever you're coming around the edge. So instead of, running and flying way behind the quarterback, sort of cutting off the angle and getting straighter down to the quarterback, definitely helpful.
A little scouting, a little statting there. Alex, your take on top performers stat-wise?
I think I'll talk about a couple of Big Ten receivers, Jahan Dotson and Garrett Wilson. Jahan Dotson of Penn State, Wilson of Ohio State. Two guys who have sort of very different profiles in terms of just the volume that they've been seeing. Dotson has almost twice as many targets, but in terms of like total EPA produced or total points for either of those guys, they're much more equal. So Wilson's been a lot more productive on a per target basis, although they're getting kind of similar looks. Wilson's just been making more plays downfield on average and has been able to just get more out of the targets given to him, 10% more positive EPA plays than Dotson. So kind of different in the opportunities that they've been given. And so it makes it hard from a statistical perspective to necessarily compare them apples to apples. But two guys that are in sort of similar environments, seeing similar teams on defense. So that at least helps when you're trying to compare the two.
Nice. Edge rushers and receivers, Wilson, Dotson, Hutchinson, and Ojabo. And that wraps up our episode for this week. Good close. For Alex Vigderman, Nathan Cooper, Matt Manicherian, and our producer, Justin Stein, I'm Mark Simon. Thank you for listening to the Off the Charts Football Podcast.